Welcome to Life After Philosophy, where I interview former students about philosophy's effect on their lives. I'm Christopher Anadale. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Dr. Edward David. He earned his MA in Philosophical Studies degree from Mount St. Mary's University in 2010 and has since earned MSt and DPhil degrees in Theology from the University of Oxford. Currently, he is the MacDonald Postdoctoral Fellow in Christian Ethics and Public Life in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford and at Christ Church, Oxford. He previously served as a research fellow at Oxford on a John Templeton Foundation grant titled Virtues and Vocations. For the past decade, he has been a consultant for the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Businesses UK program. Ed, welcome to the program.
Chris, absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
This is a quick interruption from the future. This is Dr. Anadale with Dr. David again on the line in a separate call. The body of this episode was recorded in June of 2024. It's now August 2024, and I wanted to bring you back, Dr. David, before we get into the rest of the episode, to talk about a significant move in your career that's happened since that time. What was that?
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be back, speaking from the future. So in July, I was offered what any fixed-term postdoc is aspiring towards in their short tenure in academia, which is a permanent tenure track academic job. So I was fortunate enough, blessed enough that I was interviewed and offered a joint role at King's College London. So I will be the lecturer in ethics and values in the Department for Theology and Religious Studies at King's. And I will also be in the Office of the Dean as the director of the Associateship of King's College, which is a very lofty sort of title. But what it actually is that I'm directing an extracurricular university-wide diploma in ethics for the entirety of the university. So students, staff, alumni can take this sort of lecture series for about 2 years. And if they successfully complete that, if they participate, they're able to get a diploma upon graduation if they're studying, or just a certificate if they're working or have graduated already. And they get these fancy initials, AKC, at the end of their name if they do that program. So I'm really excited to be leading the design and the academic direction of the AKC, the Associateship of King's College, and also doing what I've trained to do for the past 11 plus years. I mean, and starting with you, Chris, back at the Mount, which is diving into ethics, moral philosophy, moral theology to a certain extent. Yeah, and actually doing that in the classroom. So I'm really thrilled.
Fantastic. Congratulations on moving into a permanent post. That's marvelous. When we talked before, you were affiliated with Oxford University. Are you now leaving Oxford behind?
Yeah, so I suppose I can't double dip jobs. But yeah, I have to give up my postdoctoral research fellowship here at Christ Church, Oxford, and in the Faculty of Theology and Religion here in Oxford. But fortunately, I'm actually still going to stick around through an associate membership. That's something very generous that the theology faculty has arranged. And it's great for me because, as listeners will hear in this episode of the podcast, I have a bit of research underway dealing with exemplars, moral exemplars, theological exemplars, and my research grant will help me work on that sort of project, giving me the funding where I can bring in young people to get their perspectives on exemplars and bring them to Oxford, do a bit of participatory research, as we say. The participants will be part of the analysis of what I'm doing.
That's great. My final question was going to be, what's the fate of the postdoctoral research you had planned that we talked about back in June, which is going to be coming up?
Yeah, of course. Well, so fortunately, I have this research grant from the University of Oxford. So it's about £14,000 to do qualitative research with young people, Gen Zers, trying to understand their perspectives on religious and spiritual exemplars or role models. Fortunately, as well, King's is very supportive of these sorts of research projects, right? And outputs that I get from the research grant, despite the fact that it's funded by Oxford, will actually be accredited to King's at that point. So my new institution will be very happy about this. Now, of course, there is the challenge of, well, I'm starting a new job. I'm gonna have to do lesson prep. I'm gonna have to get used to a whole new environment of teaching. Oxford teaching is very distinct and different than other types of teaching with, big classrooms. Oxford's very small, one-on-one. I have to get used to big classroom teaching again. So there is a learning curve that I'll have to climb up, so to speak, when I start the new role. Is that going to slow down my research? Probably, right? Inevitably. But that's fine. In many ways, the deadlines are self-imposed for me, and whatever divine providence has in store for this research, I'm excited.
Well, that's great. I think this is a good intro to what's happening in your life now in August of 2024, which is a bit of a change from what we'll be talking about in just a moment in the remainder of this episode. Thanks for bringing us up to date, Ed, and congratulations on your new permanent position at King's College London.
Thanks so much.
Well, this is my first time interviewing somebody from across the ocean. We've had to adjust a little bit for the time change to be able to be on the call at the same time right now. But I'm thinking now of, Ed David, my former student, who is now almost a decade and a half later ensconced at Christ Church, Oxford. What's the story of the path that led you there, and maybe the path that takes you from an MA in philosophy to a DPhil in theology at an English university?
Ooh, great question. It's been a exciting, circuitous route. I'd say from the Mounts, from the master's program in philosophical studies, to my second postdoc here at the University of Oxford. What started it? Well, it was actually all the fantastic lectures and classes at the Mount in philosophy, right? So, to give context to listeners, I was discerning priesthood with the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and that's why I was at the Mount in the MAPS program, as we fondly call it. But during my discernment of those 2 years at the Mount, I recognized that I felt really called to dive into the intellectual life and tradition of the church. And that's where I felt really called to pursue that. Um, and so when I discerned out, as we say, of seminary, I went out into the world, had to earn my keep, so to speak, and taught at a ecumenical classical curriculum school. Absolutely loved that. I brought my philosophical training into the classroom, but I knew I wanted to earn that PhD in philosophy, theology, these subjects that I started at the Mount. So I spoke to mentors, and Oxford seemed like a good fit. Applied, somehow got in, not quite sure how. Well, I mean, let's be frank. It was the grounding and the formation from the Mount, right? Intellectually speaking, I think personally speaking, got into to Oxford and really just enjoyed my time there. Did the master's degree, did the DPhil degree, somehow by God's providence, got one postdoc, and then got another postdoc, which I'm currently in early days on that second postdoc. And so we'll see what happens next. But so that's just a quick whistle stop tour of that journey. What started it? Philosophy. Where is it now? Well, it's kind of still philosophy. It's still in the intellectual tradition of the church, and I'm able to do that here in this ecumenical setting at the University of Oxford. It's a lot of fun.
I'm curious to know, this doesn't touch on philosophy directly, but what it's like to be both an American at a British university and a Catholic at you say ecumenical, but of course, official British university, not a Catholic university. Have there been some rough edges, or has it been a fairly smooth transition for you into that environment?
Definitely rough edges. We'll say that. Nothing bad, right? No big B bad here. But the cultural differences are pretty acutely felt at least. So I remember when I first moved to Oxford in 2013, I had been Skyping, right? Remember when Skype was a thing? I was Skyping with my then landlady before landing in the UK. She was the secretary at a local Catholic parish. She arrived, or I arrived at the bus station. She picked me up, and the first thing I did was hug her because I felt, this is what Americans do, right? And we'd been Skyping all throughout the summer, getting prepared, getting to know each other, arranging things. And, and that was my first cultural faux pas. The Brits do not hug. They do not hug essentially strangers, even if you have been chatting all summer. So
Not huggers, no.
and definitely not huggers. Even shaking hands is a little odd for Brits, and maybe it's people in and around Oxford University, especially. It's very formal way of being. So culturally, as an American, also as a Filipino American, right? So Filipino culture, we are always hugging, always kissing, cheek kisses and things like that. Sharing food. These things do not happen in the UK.
I think I remember Roger Scruton one time saying that if you bump into an Englishman on the subway, he will immediately apologize to you, and that's by way of reestablishing the proper kind of social distance. Like, I beg your pardon, you're supposed to be over there, not not here in my space or touching me, etc. So this seems to be kind of part of the national character, doesn't it?
This is part of the national character for sure. And just to be very clear, when when you bump into a Brit and they say, "I'm sorry," they are not actually sorry. They're saying you need to back up. You need to watch out where you've been. So the cultural differences took a lot of getting used to, despite sharing the same language. Words are used differently. The way things are said are much more indirect here in the UK, and I very much had to get used to that. So, for example, people may ask, "Are you all right?" And they're really asking, or that's really the equivalent of "Hello, how are you?" You're not actually supposed to answer how you are. But for us Americans, if someone asks you, "Are you all right?" you go, "Oh my goodness, do I look green? Am I sick?" Something like that. So it's been a adjustment. Now that said, what is it like being a Catholic in the UK in Oxford? Well, the UK in general, there are more practicing Catholics in the UK than practicing Anglicans. That sounds great, but you have to contextualize this. There are more people who go to KFC on a Sunday than go into any sort of church, no matter if it's Catholic or some denomination. So,
Ooh.
yes, fried chicken is more popular than the Eucharist in the UK. So there's an interesting fact there. But Oxford is a fabulous place for being Catholic, right? So there's a rich tradition of Catholicism in Oxford with Gerard Manley Hopkins, Tolkien, Cardinal Newman, Saint Cardinal Newman. These real stars in Catholic intellectual life, cultural life, saints, right? It's a real privilege to be here.
Was Anscombe Oxford or Cambridge? I've forgotten.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Anscombe as well, right? So
Hmm.
Elizabeth Anscombe was here, and actually one of her daughters is still around and is a Dominican sister, and she teaches Latin at Blackfriars, Oxford, which is where I did my DPhil or PhD studies, actually. So Sister
Yeah.
Tamsin is her name.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. I was going to ask if there is a Catholic college or sort of a Catholic flavored college among the many institutions at Oxford. Is that the case, or is it sort of spread out?
So yeah, that is the case. Thank goodness. So Oxford is a collegiate university. It's very decentralized, and it's made of all of these different colleges and a small handful of permanent private halls. And the permanent private halls are degree granting. These are University of Oxford degrees, but the halls have kept their Christian character. So there's Blackfriars Hall, which is Catholic, and Campion Hall, which is Jesuit Catholic. There was St. Bennett's that closed down a couple years ago. It was Benedictine, but there is some Anglican evangelical halls as well within Oxford, and these are real cultural centers, intellectual centers for the Christian intellectual tradition writ large, having these permanent private halls at the University of Oxford.
Has the decline of popular religion in the UK, you think, had some effects, or is it having some maybe coming effects on the intellectual culture at places like Oxford?
Good question. I would say you can see the influence of a religious or Christian decay within the wider culture reflected in the university, insofar as I think the research agenda, right, is changed to respond to this demographic shift and trend, right? So within the Catholic halls, the research emphases sort of change, right? So actually, one of my projects is I'm trying to understand Generation Z, or Z, as they say here, and their religious and spiritual role models. So I am doing a sort of religious sociology project in this investigation, but the way that I'm going to analyze the data will very much be informed by moral theology, moral philosophy, trying to understand the dynamics, the moral dynamics of having role models, and specifically religious or spiritual role models. So again, the research agenda is a jest, right, in response to these national trends. But also, I think just student demand in the secular colleges in terms of pastoral provision. So it's very odd here in the UK. Religious studies is, or religious education is in the state school system. So they do learn about religions at a young age. Even in a confessional way, depending on the type of school you go to, whether it's a Church of England school or a Roman Catholic school. Um, but pastoral support in a Christian character is actually available in all of these Oxford colleges, even if they are technically secular. And it's because these institutions are just rich in tradition, and the chapel tradition within all the different colleges is still there. There are still Christian chaplains within Christ Church, which also happens to be a cathedral for the Church of England. But any of the other colleges here have Christian chaplains. So yeah, there may be religious decline, but there's still pastoral provision. It's very interesting arrangement.
Tell me more about your current project. You mentioned as a work of kind of religious sociology, but informed by a certain kind of awareness of Christian philosophical anthropology, theological ethics, and the like. How do you see that project coming together, realizing that you're at the early stages of it right now?
So I just finished a manuscript. This is the backstory to the Gen Z project, but I just finished a manuscript that analyzed, it was a study that analyzed interviews that I did with bankers in the city. And part of my interview questioning was about bankers' role models. Who do they look up to? Do they admire, and why? When I was analyzing the data, the notion of exemplars or moral exemplars really came to the fore. So whether the bankers were speaking about other people or even self-referential about themselves being a role model, displaying certain character strengths or virtues in the workplace was a big theme. So I wanted to investigate this, what they were telling me, not from a kind of flat social scientific perspective, right? Like I'm just describing, just giving an account or their account to you. I wanted to really investigate it from a Christian and theological ethical perspective. So for this purpose, I found the philosophy of Linda Zagzebski to be really useful. So she's a Catholic philosopher at the University of Oklahoma, just retired a few years ago. But she has this normative theory called exemplarist moral theory. And while some people accuse it of being circular, I still find it compelling in certain respects. So just in a nutshell, Zagzebski is trying to ground a normative theory on the emotion of admiration. So we feel admiration towards possible exemplars, people we hear about in stories or people we encounter in our daily lives. And we feel admiration towards them. They become the object of our admiration. Now, admiration has a typical or characteristic action to it. And that action is imitation of the person we admire. So we'll imitate them in some respect. Now, Zagzebski thinks that this grounding in the emotion of admiration has a lot of practical and theoretical benefits to it. One of the practical benefits is that you potentially don't need to get into arguments with people about what eudaimonia is. So arguably, if you start off, teaching young people, let's just say like middle schoolers, high schoolers, about the ethical life and starting with eudaimonia, they might not quite understand where you're coming from. You might say, well, eudaimonia is not just happiness, it's flourishing, it's something more, right? But they'll still probably think about, well, do I have a full stomach? Am I warm? Right? Things that may be superficially related to happiness. So Zagzebski tries to skirt around that traditional Aristotelian approach, though she's not anti-Aristotelian, but she skirts around the eudaimonia angle, and she says, let's focus on admiration. And we all feel admiration, and we can talk about the objects of our admiration and have a conversation with each other to suss out what it means, what different ethical terms mean vis-a-vis the people we admire. So virtue, what does virtue look like if Chris and I look at a priest with admiration? So what sort of virtues do we identify in looking at that priest, right? What does duty look like when we look at that priest, right? So all these virtue or ethical terms, rather, whether it's virtues, duties, rights, obligations, principles, values, can be defined in direct reference to the objects of our admiration. We can have that conversation about moral terms. So now I'll stop the exposition there. I'll just say the effective origin point of the theory, I think, is compelling. It is compelling. When I speak to bankers, people who do not study philosophy, if I just say, who do you admire? They start gushing about the people they admire, right? So we can start to have a moral conversation just by kind of triggering that moral emotion. And then we can dive into the why. Well, why is that person admirable? What's so ethical about them? Now, why is Zagzebski's theory potentially circular? Well, it may be we already have the normative concepts in mind baked in that are informing our admiration, right? So we may be looking at that priest as admirable because you, Chris, and I kind of share same notions of what virtue is, what human flourishing is, what moral truth is. So, what came first? Was it admiration or was it the kind of concepts, the ideas? So this is something Zagzebski's theory has to wrestle with.
That's interesting. Just thinking out loud right now as you're describing it, it occurs to me to wonder whether, just as a kind of empirical fact, whether imitation or the aspiration to imitate always goes along with admiration, or whether this presumes a certain sort of moral engagement, which you might find among bankers and other people, who are relatively advanced in their careers and relatively sort of stable and have worked out a sort of moral identity, but that you might not find in equal concentration among the youth in younger generations? I'm just thinking about a certain kind of agency problem that I've observed in many different contexts and areas of life in America the past several years. Does that come up at all in your consideration of Zagzebski's theory, the connection between admiration and the desire to imitate as a sort of motive for moral action?
I think it will come up, especially as I transition to this next project, investigating Gen Z's religious and spiritual role models. So the target age range of that study is 18 to 27-year-olds. So those are currently Gen Z age range. It technically goes down to 12-year-olds, but I didn't seek ethical permission from the university to talk to 12-year-olds, and I don't want to. So yeah, there's plenty of research within psychological and kind of developmental psychology, moral education around stages of life when we may, as a young person, sort of unreflectively imitate people, right? And our moral lives may be first and foremost shaped by following rules and being punished if we transgress some rules, or being praised if we follow rules, right? But then once we kind of develop more agency, we can start to habituate and reflect upon good practices that we may see other people doing. So maybe our parents, our friends, extended family, classmates, etc. But the true kind of critical reflection on what we are seeing and probably imitating, it seems to happen a bit later into the kind of young adults, young professional years. And I have seen that actually in my banker project. So there's a type of role model that I identify in my study and I call it the novice, sort of drawing upon the monastic tradition. But these are young people who are young people, meaning young professionals, probably 23, 24 years old, that go into finance, and they are eager to be in an industry that actually is known to be vicious or amoral, but to do it well, to do it as a good person. And what I noticed in what they told me about role models is that they are very critical about the possible role models put in front of them. There was one banking engineer who told me that her boss called a meeting and pointed to this one guy who looked like he was on the absolute like death's door. So tired. But the boss has said, "Look what Bob did. He did XYZ projects and is doing such fun things. We should all be like Bob." And the engineer pulled the boss aside apparently and said, "Look, if you're trying to motivate us, this is not going to work because Bob looked like he was about to die. And we're not going to imitate that." Right. So I think the younger generation is much more critical about who is put in front of them as a potential role model. I think that's both a function of this stage of life when people are trying to become who they want to become, right? Be their own person. But I also think it's probably a cultural trend as well when we're entering this well, we're already in it, this age where we get so much information, right? You can just go on YouTube and find different types of exemplars, whatever you want. It's just this buffet, like pick and choose whatever you want, right? In terms of who to follow, what values to endorse, etc. Right? So the Gen Z project, I think, will touch upon this phenomenon with respect to religious values, spiritual values.
Sounds fascinating. I can't wait to hear more about the sort of later stages of what you're coming up with. It sounds like part of what you're doing here in some of the interviews you describe with bankers is to sort of provoke and identify certain philosophical and normative commitments that are already in place. And that causes me to think about something I said in a previous episode. I think I described myself to another interviewee as thinking of myself occasionally as a kind of evangelist for philosophy, as somebody who's trying to sort of, spread the good news, but also kind of get people to begin reflecting upon and incorporating a certain kind of philosophical vocabulary and conceptual apparatus into their lives. Is that the kind of model you would think, sort of spreading the word about philosophy, or is it more, is what you do, you think, more in keeping with the former model I described, as sort of helping people to recognize without maybe adopting the sort of theory heavy, let's start with eudaimonia approach, realize that, in their admiration, in their selection of role models, that they're already doing a fair amount of heavy lifting in the philosophical and theological ethical realm. What do you think?
I think both approaches are vital, right? So I would call myself a natural lawyer, right? So I'm a Catholic natural lawyer through and through, and I did my DPhil very much within a natural law paradigm. I won't bore us with that topic just now, but it was Aquinas was my main point person, right? In my analysis. Moving to Zagzebski and recent projects, again, that effective point of origin, I find it to be a really useful, almost even, if I can say this, an evangelical starting point. So it is much easier to talk to people about themselves and who they admire, starting with these emotions, these positive emotions, and they tend to give much more rich answers that you can then interrogate, right? So, yeah, I admire this person. Well, why do you admire this person, right? So you can kind of play Socrates with them, starting with positive emotions and then diving down into the deep normative concepts. So I found that in working with natural law concepts, and my interlocutors were really legal theorists, political theorists. Um, it gets heavy really fast, and people disagree immediately. They disagree immediately, and I would never. Uh, sorry, let me rephrase that. I find it very hard to speak from natural law concepts or premises just with your average person, right? What I do find useful actually is talking about just basic goods. I don't say it in that terminology. Um, uh, Someone might say, "Yeah, I think doing this X activity is a good and ethical thing to do." And you ask, "Oh, well, what end is it kind of promoting?" And they'll say like justice, or the good of life or something like that, right? And so you can start to talk about the practical reasonableness around pursuing that certain end, but in more lay terms. Yet, again, I find that route not so exciting or enriching for the interlocutor as the positive emotion route, which then can go into the ethical concepts. But I think both routes are needed because people do need the kind of didactic um, formation within an intellectual moral tradition. Like they need those concepts, right? Because if you only start from the emotive and you kind of play around with the ethical concepts later on in the conversation, you're not necessarily defining things or having a clear picture of the moral life, right? So I think both are necessary.
That's a great answer. I really appreciate that. I've thought in teaching my own classroom work on ethics that the drawing people's attention to the idea of practical wisdom, to the existence of practical wisdom and the certain kind of rule that it exercises in our lives is helpful because we tend to think either in emotive or theoretical terms about ethics. We think about rule following and the like, but simply the person who is good at something, who achieves a certain kind of prudence. That seems like the kind of thing that's so close to the successful moral life that everybody has a sort of purchase on it when they reflect on their own experiences. Does that match up with things that you found as well?
Definitely. So, right, Aristotle in, I think he said book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where he's talking about practical wisdom. He says, well, how do we even define the man of practical wisdom, the phronimos? Well, you just know. You just know that person. You can just kind of tell. And So I think here we find the kind of overlap or dovetail between eudaimonistic Neo-Aristotelian ethics and then a kind of Zagzebskian admiration approach, is that the emotion and the practical wisdom come together and is exemplified in us in people, right? And this is all just to say very deeply Christian, right? So I know I'm doing a project in religious sociology with this ex Gen Z exemplar religious spiritual role model project. But the whole premise of having exemplars, in my mind, is fundamentally Christian, right? So the triune God is the exemplar, right? Christ is the exemplar, and the fact that we as human beings are attracted to or give admiration towards individuals, right? That is a deeply incarnational phenomenon, right? So we admire that suffering Christ. We admire the Lamb, right? We admire the Good Shepherd, right? We have God made man and is relatable. So this is an important aspect of role modeling, or the psychology of role modeling, is that we we admire people who are relatable in a certain sense, whose achievements we have possibly a fighting chance to achieve as well, right? So they're relatable on a certain level. So Christ is human. Uh, Achievements we can attain in some way. Well, Christ lifts us up and brings us to salvation, right? So the whole notion of exemplar, exemplarism, role model can be theologically, Christologically interpreted. And in my mind, it's that Christian lens that really sheds light and brings to fullness the whole notion of having exemplars. But because exemplars are also moral phenomena, it also brings together the emotional and the rational part of the moral life.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I I was about to say brilliant, but I think that may be another one of those Britishisms that has a different meaning in on that side of the ocean.
And brilliant is used for everything, right? So it's used for a pretty bad meal being served.
Let me ask you, if I can, the question of the show, which is about the kind of advice you might give to somebody who's in the position you were in a decade, 2 decades ago, somebody who's either sort of philosophy curious, philosophy adjacent, maybe somebody in this context who might be thinking about a banking career, who's considering minoring in philosophy, picking up some formal philosophy study, from the perspective that you've gained, looking back on the kind of education you received. What's the value of philosophy for somebody in that kind of situation, and what sort of advice would you give to them?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say just do the philosophy major, just do the philosophy minor. It's 100% worth it, both professionally and personally. I think professionally speaking, doing philosophy, the trope we hear is that it cultivates critical thinking in us. But I want to endorse that, but I want to add that I think doing philosophy, studying philosophy cultivates empathetic thinking as well. And what I mean by that is critical thinking often is defined by this activity of finding problems and things, right? We're critical about something because there's a fundamentally wrong premise somewhere in there. Or now, philosophy can help you think through and try to interrogate what might be problematic about something, and that's an important role of philosophical training. But I think philosophical training also helps you to be an empathetic thinker. So entering into another person's intellectual and emotional world, whether it's the person right in front of you over a Zoom call, for example, or whether it's an author you encounter and their argument. So I think philosophical thinking helps you to appreciate where that person is coming from, to enter into their shoes, and to have that wherewithal to ask, what was going on in the author's mind when they wrote this argument? What was going on in their life? What was going on in their society at this time, right? So philosophical thinking gives you that capacious mindset to just range far and wide on what to ask. And that's really important for the virtue of empathy. So I think when you are exercising your philosophical mind, you're exercising the virtue of empathy, right? Because you're entering into another world and appreciating what that world is contributing to the philosophical argument there. So I think philosophy helps us with critical thinking. It helps us with empathic or empathetic thinking. And because of that, because I think the emotional part of the empathic is there, it helps us to just be better humans, right? So as we see this rise in large language models and artificial intelligence, that of course lack, and maybe this is a controversial claim, but of course lack sentience and lack emotional faculties of the human person. It's going to be that much more important for us to really hone these human virtues. And philosophy, good philosophy, right? Philosophy, which is the pursuit of wisdom, the study of wisdom, will engage those human virtues like empathy that touch upon emotion. So, sorry, this is kind of rambling into the professional and personal, but you need, if I can directly address that person listening, you need those human virtues to be a good professional. And over again, we see in these kind of industry reports, etc., that having those interpersonal skills that are associated with leadership, team leadership, self-leadership, organizational leadership, strategic thinking, in order to do those types of leading, you need to be deeply human. And philosophy, again, a good philosophy, especially one grounded, I think, in the Catholic intellectual tradition, will help you be human. So I think employers, I myself, so I've done a bit of hiring myself. I hire people from the humanities because I know they're smart enough to learn the techie stuff, but I can already trust that they can think well, that they can write well, that they can enter into other people's perspectives well and take all of those positions on board. So dive into philosophy. That's my advice.
That's fantastic advice. Wonderful. It does seem to me that if there's going to be some kind of systematic transformation or serious reform of all of our different institutions, it's going to come about through people who are more fully human and therefore more fully and even more self-consciously virtuous than they have been or might have been otherwise.
Definitely.
That's a good place for us to wrap up. My guest on this episode of Life After Philosophy has been Dr. Edward David of the University of Oxford. Ed, thank you so much for being with us today.
Kristen, thanks for the kind of invitation. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.